Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, or NWMOA, and I'm joined today by my colleague Lynn Rubenstein from NERC. Lynn, you want to say hello? And we're going to be jointly facilitating today's webinar. It's a joint webinar of NERC and NWMOA's on gas cylinders and EPR. We're very excited to have this panel, and we will have a very timely announcement, which I won't take the thunder from that in a few minutes. We're going to wait a few minutes because there's a lot of people who are still logging into the webinar, and then we'll get underway. Okay, so let's get started. Again, I'm Terry Goldberg. I'm with NWMOA, and I'm joined by my colleague Lynn Rubenstein from NERC, and this is a joint NWMOA-NERC webinar focused on EPR for gas cylinders, which is an amazingly timely webinar today. Welcome all of you. Just want to make sure everybody knows we are recording this webinar. We will be posting the recording on the NERC and NWMOA websites. Probably NERC will be first to do that. They're always faster than we are. We will also be posting the PowerPoint slides today that you're going to see on both websites. So check back if you want all the materials from today's webinar. If you have a question during the presentations, we're going to start with the presentations, and then we will have hopefully about 25 minutes or so for questions and answers. And we know that's a favorite part of the webinar for everyone. So please post your questions in the question box. You should see it on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you want to, if your control panel is not expanded, click on the little orange arrow on the side of the panel, and then the panel will appear. You can see in the gray rows one that says questions. If you click on the square with the dash through it, that will blow up the questions feature, and then you can type your questions in. We urge all of you to ask questions as the presentations proceed, and we will moderate the Q&A with the panel at the end. If you have something you want to communicate to me or Lynn, you can use the chat feature. That's not really for questions, more for any issues that you have or things you want to let us know about in terms of how the webinar is going. So again, please raise your questions, and we'll have a lively Q&A at the end. This is an interesting and really timely topic. So this is a really great panel today. We're going to start with a presentation from Jennifer Heaton-Jones. She's the Executive Director of the Housatonic Resources Recovery Authority. It's a regional governmental solid waste management authority serving 14 municipalities in Western Connecticut. She's been active in the Housatonic Resource Recovery Authority since 2009. She's the current chair of the Connecticut Product Stewardship Council, vice president of the Connecticut Recyclers Coalition, and president of the Northeast chapter of the North American Hazardous Materials Management Association, or NAMA. So it's great to have Jen. She's going to start this panel today. She's going to be followed by Peter Hargreave. Peter is the president of Policy Integrity, Inc., a small environmental consultancy in Ontario, Canada. He has over 18 years' experience in providing strategic advice in the development, implementation, and oversight of public policy. Over his professional career, he has worked closely with service providers, producers, and federal, state, and local governments on waste and recycling policies and programs. And Peter's presentation is going to be done jointly with Annie Lane, who is the Director for Product Sustainability at Worthington Industries, where she is responsible for implementing sustainability strategies for the business's consumer products. She has more than 15 years of experience deploying energy and environmental solutions, working across industry, government, and nonprofit organizations. And finally, we're excited to have Mary Cummings join us. She leads the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority registry, support, compliance, and enforcement functions, and she's going to describe what that RPRAs, it's a new acronym for me, does. But her work includes overseeing inspections, prosecutions, compliance orders, administrative penalties, offense provisions, and the registry system used to receive and store information related to resource recovery, and waste reduction activities. Mary has over 15 years of experience in delivering regulatory programs, stakeholder relations, and program policy developments in the public and not-for-profit sectors. So this is a great panel today, and I'm going to start with Jennifer's presentation. So take it away, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn my camera off. All right, good morning, and I am honored to be here today, and it is quite timely. So let's see if I can get this presentation to work. Okay. There are various types of cylinders we as municipalities are left to manage. And although many have return and exchange programs, municipalities are still left dealing with the unwanted and discarded. So not all cylinders are considered hazardous, but they all do require at some point an end-of-life management. Today, I will focus on the issues and concerns municipalities face with gas cylinders. This slide shows the various cylinders or programs available to our residents. We have refillable propane tanks, typically 7 pounds and above. Most common are the 20-pound gas grill tanks. We have self-refillable propane tanks, for example, the 1-pound cylinder manufactured by Flame King that's in the bottom right. Propane exchange programs such as AmeriGas, Blue Rhino, that are found at many local gas stations or grocery stores. And then there's the single-use propane tank, a 1-pound camping cylinders. They're also known as DOT-39 or disposable cylinders. So non-refillable gas cylinders and canisters containing anywhere from a few ounces to 4 pounds of liquid propane, butane, there's a mix, helium, and other compressed gases have been used for many years as portable sources of fuel for camping, hobbies, parties, and home repair. These cylinders are designed as single use, and it's impossible to safely refill them as currently constructed. In addition, the only other alternatives, disposal and recycling, both pose problems. When the tanks are discarded with gas remaining, they have the potential to explode in garbage trucks or waste processing machinery. The design of the cylinders makes safe collection of any remaining gases extremely difficult for municipalities. And finally, while the materials in the cylinders are 100% recyclable, scrap dealers are often reluctant to take them from us as they are labor intensive to devalve and prepare for scrapping. Cylinders can be difficult to manage and recycle for our municipalities, transfer station operators, residents who utilize our local recycling centers, transfer stations, or HHW collection events really just want one thing. They want to get rid of their stuff. The problem we are left with is how to manage and pay for the disposal. And many of us do have vendors who will take our 20-pound tanks at our local drop-offs, but for a fee. It's often very confusing who will take what and when. And although there are some free programs for good tanks, there's almost always a fee for old rusty tanks. There is no one, at least in our area, that will collect and transport the 1-pound single-use propane tanks. In order for a scrapyard to take them, they must be devalved and punctured twice with a hole before discarding into a scrap metal container. Transfer station operators and their municipal managers do not want their employees puncturing those holes. And we can't forget that there are OSHA regulations. There's also very few outlets. Nearly all our scrap yards don't want them. They pose that risk that I mentioned, the danger. It's really the danger to the shredding equipment and to their employees when they do potentially explode through the shredding equipment. Even the smallest amount of propane will create a significant explosion. We also do have litter issues. There are thousands of cylinders that are left behind in parks every year. Between Connecticut Deep and Yosemite National Park, there are many reports. I mean, Yosemite has reported 20 to 25,000 a year, and they truck them more than 2 hours to a facility that takes low-grade hazardous waste. They can be costly. They are a cost burden on municipalities and the state. Yes, we can get rid of those 20-pound tanks at our local drop-offs for around $2 or $5 per unit, but when they come into our HHW events, they can run us $10 to $20 per unit. And the single use are usually packed in a drum or a box, and we're charged approximately $200 to $500 each. interesting, this morning I was contacted by a colleague, quite timely, asking if I had any resources, as his single-use canisters were being quoted $17 per unit and $71 per unit for the 20-pound cylinders. I did give him some good resources to reduce his cost. And then last, there's the danger. They are dangerous. Cylinders are often hidden in our recycling stream and are an extreme danger to our material recovery facilities where they can explode. There are many recorded incidents. Even just last month, we had an incident at our Hartford facility. So this is an example. Actually, I'm sorry, I switched slides. Many of our transfer stations are self-served. We cannot possibly monitor every resident who comes in with material. This is a memo from Sims, the world's largest scrap metal recycler. They do not want gas cylinders. If they do find a cylinder in our containers, they will charge us $40 per unit. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. This is what's left of a 20-pound tank after it has exploded. These two separate tanks came from NERA, the Hartford facility. Next, I want to show you that, well, pictures and videos are worth more than my words. I want to show you what it actually looks like in the moment. So this is a material recovery facility in the state of Connecticut. These are two separate incidents. You can see I repeated it. This is the three gentlemen standing, and this is one individual while they're watching the material going through the processor. And then later on, you'll see this is Mirror, the Hartford plant. This is in the past. This is not the one that happened last month. There are several incidents that happen throughout this video where you can see a propane tank at some point hits a shredder or a sorting device, and unfortunately, there's enough propane left in the canister that creates this explosion. This is the last. This is actually, the rooftop is designed so that if there is an explosion, it does come off. So I think that images can give you a good taste of what is actually happening inside our facilities. Let's see, this video, it is available on YouTube. It was produced by the Department of Transportation. I know you can't hear the volume, so I'll just explain to you what the video is, and we're not going to watch the whole thing. But it was produced by the Department of Transportation as a public service announcement on non-refillable gas cylinders. The US DOT cautions folks to never refill a single-use propane tank on their own. They do mention there are refillable 1-pound cylinders available on the market. This is also a story from 2016 of a woman by the name of Courtney Campbell who died from the explosion. She had put a coupler on her 20-pound tank to her single-use tank to refill them for a heater. There was unfortunately a leak and the 20-pound tank exploded. Again, you can watch the entire video on YouTube, but really the purpose of me showing this video is the need for public education on the safe handling of cylinders and the proper use and disposal. So what's the solution? I personally believe EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, is an important tool as we, as municipalities and regional waste authorities, can utilize. So producers share with us the responsibility and the burden of end-of-life management. They create a plan that includes collection, transportation, and disposal, and the program covers the cost. A stewardship program is created to manage the program like we have with Paint Care and Bye Bye Mattress in Connecticut. The plan should also incorporate and take into consideration design for the environment. The plan must have performance targets that create accountability, and the plan must have collection convenience standards. It must be easy, free, and convenient for our residents. And no program should leave out outreach and education. It is the most important component to getting the generator to do the right thing. So I wanted to share a little history on this issue. I had known for many years that the Product Stewardship Institute had conducted a study back in 2003 and had long wanted to bring it to Connecticut. When they began to be more difficult to manage for my 14-member towns, I decided to take action. The reason for the bill was gas cylinders are necessary to life, but are hazardous and difficult to manage. And I wasn't interested in a ban, but a management solution. As I mentioned before, they end up in the waste stream without due proper concern. To ensure these materials are efficiently and effectively properly disposed, recycled, or reclaimed, the necessary regulatory framework is required. Connecticut has had successful extended producer responsibility programs for other items, so why not gas cylinders? As the chair of the Connecticut Product Stewardship Council, I introduced EPR legislation in 2020. That legislation was actually co-written, and I want to give credit to Cheryl Baldwin at Connecticut Deep, and shared with the council for support. And unfortunately, due to COVID, it never actually had a hearing. We spent the summer and fall modifying the language, and we conducted a national stakeholder meeting facilitated by PSI that included industry. Unfortunately, at that time, Worthington did not join us. We took into account input, questions, and concerns from those who participated and modified the elements of that bill. We reintroduced new legislation in January of 2021. This time it was coupled with tires and smoke detectors. That was a decision made by legislators to help save time due to the new legislative climate with COVID. And then the bill passed out of the Environment Committee and made it through fiscal analysis, but never made it into the House floor. Behind the scenes, Worthington was asked to come back with a proposal in 2022. So last summer, I was pleased to be contacted by Peter Hargreave, and the process began. And a long story short, I'm pleased to announce today that House Bill 5142 passed unanimously out of the committee, the House, and last night out of the Senate. So we can nearly say, well, with the governor's signature, that we have the first EPR for cylinders in the country. Meanwhile, I want to mention that Vermont introduced their own bill this year that did pass out of the Senate, but not the House. California actually introduced a ban on single-use cylinders, and Maine and Oregon's packaging EPR bill does include cylinders. Lastly, I do want to publicly thank Peter and Worthington for their work in Connecticut. I believe we set a new precedent on how businesses and government can work together to create solutions that do work for both parties. And I look forward to coordinating the signing ceremony with the governor, with Worthington. So with that, here's my contact information, and I'll pass my presentation to the next speaker.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jen.
Okay. Thank you all. Jen, thanks for that great introduction. As we were introduced today, I'm Annie Lane from Worthington Industries, and I wanted to kick off the presentation and then turn it over to Peter to get into the details of the work that was done in Connecticut with Jen and other stakeholders. So as Jen mentioned, when Worthington was first engaged in Connecticut on this EPR legislation, this was new to us. We're still learning about these programs, and when the bill didn't move forward in that first year when it was combined with the other products, we saw the opportunity to take a more proactive approach to understanding, learning about EPR and thinking about how it could best be tackled in the state of Connecticut. So it was a great chance to engage with Peter and other EPR experts to help design a program that really worked for everyone involved. So Peter, going forward, Peter's going to take over after this brief introduction and walk us through the work that was done in Connecticut and the approach that was taken to the plan. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about Worthington Industries. We at Worthington see the need to enhance our sustainability efforts across the company, and within our consumer products business, there's a growing need to take on responsibility for end-of-life management for our products. As a leading manufacturer in the US of both refillable and non-refillable pressurized cylinders, we felt the need to kind of stand up and get smart about EPR and work with Peter and stakeholders in Connecticut to design a program, as I said, that works for everyone. And what we'd like to do from this experience in Connecticut is look to use this as a model and scale this into other jurisdictions as the need and opportunity grows for EPR programs. So with that, I want to turn it over to Peter and give him plenty of time to talk about the work that was done in the state of Connecticut. Peter, you good?
Thanks, Annie. And a big thank you to NERC and NUOMA for setting this up perfectly in timing so that we can talk about this as the legislation is moved to the final step in Connecticut. I think we're pretty excited to see that the distance that's been covered over the last year, and excited to talk about it in more detail. So about a year ago, Worthington committed to meeting a series of objectives set by Connecticut legislators, and they did so, all due credit deserved, with the initial bill failing, which Jen has talked about already. Basically, the objectives were to ensure free, convenient, and accessible statewide collection of discarded residential pressurized cylinders, ensure that the system would show meaningful continuous improvement, and prove the proper management of the resources associated with those cylinders. Myself, my colleague Glenda Gies, and GT Environmental were brought on by Worthington to establish an approach which including understanding best practices, reviewing Connecticut's initial legislation, gaining an understanding of really the current conditions in Connecticut. The goal was to develop a plan that could achieve the objectives set out by the Connecticut legislators, and then inform how the legislation might be modified based on the plan put together. As part of the work, we looked at producer responsibilities policies currently in place. While there aren't, there aren't any producer responsibility programs in place for gas cylinders in the US, there is definitely a lot happening in Canada. So at the time, this included Ontario, which Mary Cummins will speak to afterwards, and a program in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Since we started our work, there has been additional movement. Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta are all currently in consultations on EPR regulations for gas cylinders. Quebec, I think, is expected to pass their regulation in the next month. Alberta is expected to pass by the summer of this year, and BC has committed to having a program in place by 2025. There is the Yukon is a little further behind, but they have certainly provided some indication that they will be looking to align with Alberta. So we gathered certainly learnings from the policies and programs in place that helped to provide some guidance to Worthington as to how they might want to structure their plan and the policy within Connecticut, and certainly identifying what has and what has not worked. And I'll get into that a little bit into more detail in the next slides. Beyond the objectives stated, there were 4 principles that Worthington wanted to guide the work. First, ensure that a level playing field existed so that one company was not unfairly carrying the burden of all the others. And this could be based on, making sure that all producers were captured, or again, if there was a narrow definition set for the products, there may also be issues with a level playing field. Second, the focus needed to be on outcomes, not the process that dictated the exact how, when, and where cylinders should be collected. So how might Worthington be able to innovate in how those cylinders were collected and processed? Third, ensuring proper oversight enforcement, and that really relates back to the first point or the first principle about ensuring a level playing field. This is certainly an area that governments have often neglected, and one I think Mary will discuss in some more detail. when she presents. And finally, we wanted to ensure that the timelines were achievable and allowed for implementation to be completed successfully. The first step of the work that we undertook was really to better understand the existing collection and recycling system, to identify how that system could be leveraged, where opportunities existed to increase collection and expand processing capacity, and what barriers might need to be overcome in Connecticut. We also needed to understand, for planning and logistics purposes, the following: where cylinders are being collected and how they are being handled at those locations, understanding seasonality and collection volumes, where cylinders are being processed and whether those facilities had capacity to handle increased volumes, which companies were best positioned to provide services in order to build an effective collection and processing system. So we did a large survey of municipalities, state parks, private campgrounds, colleges. We talked to waste service providers and to gas distributors. I will say, I think at the beginning there was certainly a lot of uncertainty about the work that we were doing. But I will say we were very pleased. We had a lot of support from some key players within the state, Jen Heaton-Jones, Tom Metzner, and James Albus from DEEP. And there were a number of other associations that were very helpful in helping us to gather data to understand exactly what was happening on the ground. Like most other jurisdictions, I will be blunt, the data was not great, and that's not unexpected. But it helped us to be able to understand what the context is and how to establish the plan. It highlighted where the inefficiencies were and where there were opportunities that could be addressed through the program plan. And I think Jen spoke to some of those already, with certainly issues around the costing of the collection and processing of cylinders, which varied significantly around the state. So based on the work undertaken, Worthington put forward a plan where they would be responsible to collect and properly manage residential pressurized cylinders. The plan included a collection network that would include arrangement for collection of cylinders from state parks, campgrounds, municipal sites and events, disposal and recycling facilities where they may inadvertently end up, and also to develop a retail collection pilot. The plan also included a marketing awareness campaign to ensure that consumers were educated. And it was really built, the whole plan was built to allow other producers other than Worthington to join, or if they wanted to, they could certainly develop a separate plan if that made sense from their perspective. Just getting into more detail, the definition of in-scope cylinders includes a range of gas cylinders that contain helium, carbon dioxide, and flammable materials in both the non-refillable and refillable formats. What was put forward broadened the original definition to include everything sort of 20 pounds and under, so getting into some of the smaller format cylinders like the 5.5 ounce butane cylinders and the isobutane camping cylinders. The rationale to do this was it was really anticipated these cylinders would be collected. Residents are going to have difficulty understanding the differences, so they're all going to come back, so make sure that all of those cylinders were included. The plan specifically excluded medical, commercial, industrial cylinders. Given that these are all generally dealt with through commercial arrangements, these cylinders generally have a market value and do not generally make their way back to residential collection sites. There was also, I think, an understanding that as you got into the larger format, there was a significant impact potentially on some of the logistics of managing and collecting those cylinders. The plan also excluded certain gases that were seen mainly to be used in commercial applications, such as oxygen, refrigerants, acetylene, hydrogen, ethylene, and foam adhesives. Targets in the plan were based on or were set for non-refillable cylinders. Given that the data was poor, the commitment was made to reassess those targets after the first year of operation of the program. So once better data was actually collected. A target for refillables was not set, given these cylinders generally are managed through exchange systems and have high return rates. So difficult to be able to set targets for those types of materials. The plan also included tracking of outcomes and annual reporting. So again, we worked pretty closely with Connecticut legislators, DEEP, and other key stakeholders on the revised legislation, and based on the lessons learned from the plan, the guiding principles, and certainly what we understood from other jurisdictions. Worthington was supportive of this legislation and pretty pleased of the results, with that legislation passing the House and the Senate with unanimous all-party support. Just want to talk about a couple of key elements of the actual legislation itself. The definition of producer was very deliberately written and is based on over a decade of learnings about loopholes and issues that have been caused by poor definitions in other jurisdictions. So it's a hierarchy approach, as you can see sort of on the right-hand side of your screen, which really ensures that there's clarity and it reduces any of the potential conflict if there is more than one producer that is identified. It addresses out-of-state suppliers and e-commerce retailers. It allows for voluntary producers. This is sometimes needed to help reduce administrative burden where a brand holder might be out of jurisdiction, out of state, but is willing to come forward to reduce the burden for the retailers of their products or for the importers. The definition of supplied, it broadens what you may typically see in EPR legislation, which generally use the term sale or sell. So this really just allows for the ability to capture more different types of transactions by which products may be supplied to consumers within a state. So making sure that that's broader, it is certainly a jurisdictional best practice that's used in Canadian jurisdictions. It provides flexibility on meeting the outcomes, so it allows potentially for multiple plans. There are certainly examples with gas cylinders where a company may have more of a natural type of return system, so they may want to take a slightly different approach in how they're picking up their materials. It focuses on outcomes and not the process. Certainly, prescriptive requirements can disincent the most effective and efficient systems put in place. You want to try to reduce those costs and ensure you've got more materials and more focus on pulling new materials back. And also, there are no financial or fiscal requirements, so it doesn't dictate how the program is funded. Certainly in Connecticut, there are programs that require consumer fees at retail. So instead, the plan allows for flexibility in how producers decide to set up their program. Worthington plans to internalize the costs of non-refillable cylinders. It has certainly heard through this process strong concerns from retailers about visible fees, and so it has no plans on moving forward with visible fees. But it does allow, again, not stating any financial requirements, does allow for other types of approaches. So for the refillable cylinders, they do use a deposit-like approach, and so this would allow them to continue operating that program the same way. For designated materials, again, the focus was on residential cylinders. We did specifically exclude controversial cylinders. So fire extinguishers tend to be a hot point. We wanted to make sure this legislation could move forward. And again, non-residential cylinders generally have a system in place to manage those cylinders. For oversight and enforcement, there is a funding mechanism to ensure that the oversight body is properly resourced. It does require reporting about that from that oversight body to monitor to make sure that funds are being used properly, and that obviously that organization is completing the proper tasks to ensure that producers are identified and there aren't free riding producers. The other thing is there is a strong enforcement provision within the Act. There is the ability for Connecticut to ban cylinders from sale within the state. Worthington had pushed for administrative penalties as well. There wasn't enough time to get this addressed within the bill, but it is certainly something Connecticut would like to, or sorry, Worthington would like to see in the future and within other states. And the last thing I'll mention is timeline. The timeline that's provided through the legislation does provide adequate time for all parties, the government to review stewardship plans, the ability for potential revisions to be made, the ability for multiple plans to come forward. And the big thing, which comes down to adequate timing to implement the programs, which is something, again, that is not necessarily always taken into account. It also does avoid winter start dates, which can certainly be an issue when you're trying to get consumer buy-in, and there are problems with winter storms and other problems associated with weather conditions. So I will leave it at that. Our contact information is here. We are certainly, both Annie and I, if there are questions after or information that folks need, we are certainly available and happy to answer any of those questions that come forward. And I think I will hand it over now to Mary.
Hi, thank you, Peter. There we are. So you should be able to see my screen now. So I'll just start up. So thank you for having me here today to speak about what's been going on in Ontario around extended producer responsibility with pressurized containers. It's relatively recent. So some of this information is new and evolving and changing as we talk even right now. So before we get into the details too much, I want to give you an overview of what I'd like to cover. So an introduction to who RPRA is. We sometimes just go by the authority, just for simplicity. So I want to walk through a little bit about our role in oversight and enforcement in Ontario. Talk through a little bit about the new hazardous and special products regulation, which came out last June, came into full force October 1st of last year, and just sort of walk through some of the materials that are included in that, and very specifically, that is where pressurized containers is obligated and the obligations are outlined. We'll talk a little bit about what those pressurized containers are included in the HSP regulation, who is the producer and what their obligations are, how the entire sort of system works itself, and then some of the challenges we've come into with regards to enforcing the regulation and other resources that are available for folks. So to start up, just an introduction, who is RPRA? Who is the authority? So the authority was created in 2016 under legislation here in Ontario to be the oversight body, to be the compliance and enforcement, to fulfill the compliance and enforcement function of all of Ontario's extended producer responsibility legislation. So what that means is we don't just oversee the HSP regulation, so that hazardous and special products regulation where pressurized containers are obligated, but we also oversee the Blue Box program. So we do compliance enforcement for that. We do compliance and enforcement with the regulatory authority for batteries, electronics, lighting, and tires as well. Tires was actually our first extended producer responsibility material in Ontario. So we had programs historically and previously. So for instance, pressurized containers had been operating since 2008 under a different construct. We're not going to talk a lot about that today, about what this WDTA thing was, what programs existed before. We're just going to really kind of focus on the future and the way that this new regulation, this HSP regulation works and how it works with RPRA. So you've got now this new framework in Ontario where you've got the Ontario government who's developing the actual policy, who's setting what regulatory requirements are there, what outcomes they want to see producers meeting under the IPR regulations. You've got the authority. The authority, as Peter mentioned earlier, we're the enforcement and oversight regulatory authority. So we're the ones who are making sure that the entire system is actually operating the way that the Ontario government intended it to and wrote it up. So we have powers much like any regulatory authority would have for inspections, audit, investigation. We can issue compliance orders, so compliance orders requiring an individual captured to actually comply with the regulation. We do have administrative penalties. I heard that not right now for the states, but in Ontario, there are administrative penalties that can be issued for non-compliance. And we also have the ability to prosecute for non-compliance. Then you have the producers, and the producers are identified by the regulation. So the Ontario government decides who, in terms of what hierarchy, is responsible for adhering with the regulation and accountable for ensuring that the system works. You have something called producer responsibility organizations. So producer responsibility organizations are private companies. They're not overseen directly by the authority, not set up by the authority. They could be not-for-profit, for-profit. It's really up to them. Their companies are created that go to the producers. So for instance, an HSP producer or a producer of pressurized containers and say, we can help you comply with these regulatory requirements. We'll make sure that you're in compliance, and they pay fees and costs to those producer responsibility organizations in order to comply. There are multiple producer responsibility organizations in Ontario, all competing with each other to try and get producer clients for each of the materials in order to try to get them to comply. So for instance, in tires, we have 5 producer responsibility organizations, all competing for producers who have obligations under the tires regulation, who these pros want to be able to get their clients, get these producers in order to get them to comply. And then we also have service providers. The service providers are also identified under each of the regulations as having particular obligations to report to the authority, to register with the authority, to report data to the authority about how much material they actually collect or manage, how much is going to landfill. So the authority is actually not just in the position of being able to play this regulatory authority role, but we're also in the position of having all of the data. So we're sort of sitting at the top, looking through. All the producers are reporting into us, all the service providers are reporting into us, the producers who have identified these pros who are helping them figure out how to comply with the regulations are all reporting into us. So we're in the position to take a look at the regulation that the Ontario government's put out and say, is it working? Are folks in compliance? What are the diversion rates looking like? And using those inspection powers, using our compliance orders, our prosecutions to make sure the whole system flows through. It is an outcomes-based regulation, so similar to what you folks have there and what was just described, in the sense that the regulations all say, this is what we want you to do, not this is how you do it. There are no program plans to be approved or anything like that. It's really quite simply this: you're given an outcome in the regulation. You hire a pro if you're the obligated producer to achieve that outcome. That pro works with service providers to achieve that outcome for you. You report on achieving that outcome to RPRA. So let's talk a little bit about Ontario's new HSP regulation, because it's very specifically, now that you've got sort of a overall arching framework here of how the systems work. Let's talk about the HSP regulation, which is where you'll see there's a few materials covered under the HSP regulation, but we're going to focus on pressurized containers. Very specifically, the HSP regulation covers non-refillable, refillable, and refillable propane. And the reason they're broken down like that is that the ministry, our Ministry of Environment here, wanted different types of requirements for each of those different types of pressurized containers. So they're broken out like that on purpose. So let's talk about what those obligations look like. So first, you've got non-refillable pressurized containers. So those are much what some of the images are down below there. The helium tanks that you can buy for balloons, the connecting to your stove for camping, for propane. These are one bucket of type of obligated material, and they carry very specific types of outcomes that they need to be able to achieve. Next, you have refillable pressurized containers. You'll note propane is not included in this list. So propane refillable pressurized containers versus all of the other types of refillable pressurized containers, the ministry very specifically identified a different set of outcome for this. So what we're talking about here, I really think beverage CO2 cylinders, right? So carbonating your water, wielding gas cylinders, things like that. The ministry, the regulation does include industrial commercial uses as well. So it's not just about residential uses, but it does put a limit on the size of the container of 109 liters. And it does that just so that we're not capturing the too much of that industrial commercial industry. Then we spoke about this, there's the refillable propane. So a very specific carve out for those barbecue tanks is really what we're talking about here. So before we get into what needs to happen with these containers, let's talk about a little bit about who's actually obligated. It looks like it's very similar to what Peter just presented there. So you've got brand holder who's resident in Canada. If there's no brand holder, that hierarchy moves to the importer, and then the hierarchy moves into the individual who's doing the direct marketing to the consumers, and it continues all the way through. So the point is that at some point, someone would be captured to have these obligations. To date, right now, recognizing that this program, the regulation came out June last year, the registration deadline for producers to declare that they're the obligated producer was November 30th of last year. We have 25 pressurized container producers registered with us. We know that there's more. We do have, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're a regulatory authority. We have the ability to go after these free riders. But right now we're focused primarily on, this is a massive change management exercise for producers, for those service providers, the haulers, the processors, the municipalities. We're really focused on communications. We're not really looking at utilizing our compliance tools, our full suite of compliance tools at this point, and instead coming at it from the perspective of once companies understand their obligations, once they've gotten to the point that they understand that they are in fact obligated to perform under this regulation, they will register and they will comply. So it's really just working that through with them. These timelines for this regulation are very tight. We're going to talk about that in terms of one of the challenges that we're having with this regulation around propane and other refillable cylinders. But right now, the idea is that we're really trying to work with the industry and the businesses to help them understand what their obligations are. So what are those obligations for those producers, for those companies? Now, not everybody under the HSP regulation has the same obligations. Very specifically, not even those three material categories, if you will, of pressurized containers have the same obligations. So we'll sort of break that down. So you've got the non-refillable pressurized containers. Their obligations include all 6 of these. So they have to set up an accessible system across the province in order to actually collect the non-refillable tanks. They have management requirements, so they have to have a certain collection target, or sorry, a certain recovery target. So of what that system, that accessible system that they set up, how much of what that system produces has to be recovered is outlined in the regulation. They have P&E requirements. They have registration and reporting requirements to RPRA, and then they of course have auditing and record keeping. But then when you move to a refillable pressurized container, they still have some of these obligations, but not all of them. And in part, that's because of the system that already does exist, and this was also touched upon with regards to refillable containers. So they don't have to set up a collection system. They don't have management requirements. They don't have P&E. They don't have supply data reporting to us. They do have registration requirements. They have to keep records. And they do actually have to have a certain amount of, or sorry, they have to have a different type of collection system than what you would think of in terms of, you know, a collection site at municipalities and such. They have to have a call-in number available. So what that really gets at is that if you're a refillable pressurized container, you've got a system that's been set up where you're getting those tanks back, you're refilling them. It's supposed to be a closed loop system, but some of the leakage happens and some of those tanks end up, let's say, at a municipality. There's a call-in number that they're required to provide to that municipality, and when the municipality calls in to say, I have these tanks, those producers are obligated to ensure that someone goes and gets them. So that's sort of what's going on around the propane refillables. And so I'll move on to how the system actually is being set up right now. So you've got, I mentioned this earlier, that everyone reports into the authority, the haulers, the processors, and really that's just so that the authority has an overarching view of how the system's actually being operated and whether or not the outcomes that are supposed to be achieved under that regulation are achieved. We spoke a little bit about the pros as well already. And those pros, there are 9 registered with RPRA for HSP. I'm not sure how many of those are specifically for pressurized containers, but that information is available on our website. And these pros are really saying, so if you're a non-refillable pressurized container, they're saying, okay, you have particular collection requirements. You have to have a certain amount of sites set up across the province. You have to make sure that you're hauling them. You have to make sure that you're collecting and managing to a particular rate. These pros are engaging with the service providers, the haulers, and the processors to ensure the producers are able to meet those outcomes. So some of the challenges we've had in forcing the HSP regulation, there's been a few. Very specifically, I'll talk to those around pressurized containers and the key challenges that we've had and some things to maybe look out for when you're looking at designing an EPR legislation and setting it up. I think the number one challenge that we've encountered has been around those timelines. As I said, the regulation came out in June. Producer obligations began October 1st of that same year. They had to register with the authority November 30th and tell us how, you know, this is my pro who's going to set this up, or I'm going to be able to do it on my own, because that option does exist as well, depending on which material category they're with. And so really the timelines were quite tight for a huge exercise in change management. A lot of time was needed to figure out, and we're still figuring out, who is actually obligated, right? Who is the producer for what particular material? There's a lot of research that needed to be taken, not just for the producers to figure it out, but also for RPRA, the authority, to provide guidance to those producers about what would and would not constitute compliance under the regulation. Definitions changed and expanded in scope from what was previously obligated under some of those old programs I mentioned at the beginning that had been operating since 2008. So now you've got pressurized container folks who, you know, may have been used to reporting a particular way and now are being told they have to include other material that they previously didn't have obligations for, and that's been taking a lot of time. So I think, to summarize, well, there's a few different challenges noted here. I think really what it comes down to is adequate transition time and making sure that there's enough time for producers to understand their obligation, for producers to understand that they are in fact a producer, for them to understand what materials they have these obligations for, to go out into the market, because this is an individual producer responsibility. It's not a program plan that's being developed and written that they just join and pay into. This is something where they're actually going out, these producers, and saying, these are my obligations under the regulation. Now I'm going to enter into market-based contractual negotiations with, whether that's a producer responsibility organization to meet on my behalf, or whether that's going to be me directly dealing with haulers and processors to meet my obligations. Those pros, if I enter into a contract with a pro to meet my obligations, the pro equally has to have time to go and talk to all the haulers and processors, basically set up the entire network. And without adequate time for all of that to happen, it's very crunched. and difficult for folks to navigate. So I'd say one of the biggest things when you're trying to frame EPR legislation is to really make sure you can't give the market enough time to really adapt to what you're setting the expectations for, especially if it's not a program plan that's been developed and then folks are joining it. If you're looking at doing an outcomes-based regulation or outcomes-based EPR framework, you really want to give folks time to actually adapt and set up the network the way that the outcomes want it to be achieved. So some additional resources available to folks, and I understand these slides will be made available to folks afterwards, so you can click on this information. We've got our website, and we also have our monthly newsletter with more information if you're looking for more detail around pressurized containers or the HSP regulation or any of the regulations that RPRA oversees. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. That was tremendous, fascinating. There's been many questions that have come in, and we have time for more to be populated in the question box. Just a reminder, I'm Lynn Rubenstein, and with NERC, and I'll be facilitating the question and answer period. So, Peter, I'm going to start with a question to you. So, Peter, you indicated that the Connecticut timeline is achievable, and especially given all the horror stories Mary just gave us. So there's some questions about, well, what is that time frame? So what people were asking about the details, what is the timeline? And then I'll add in, and does it effectively address the concerns that Mary just identified? I can't hear you, Peter. I believe, there you go, thank you. Yes, great.
So we can certainly make the program, the plan that we put forward, make it available to folks. I don't have the timeline directly in front of me, but I think, there is going to be an issue, which is, or there's not going to be an issue, but there are several steps that need adequate time. So you need adequate time. In this case, there is a plan that is required to be put together. So Worthington has already undergone the effort to put that plan together. Certainly, whatever producers out there are welcome to join that plan. But if other entities wanted to put forward their own plan, we've built in time into the schedule for them to put that work together. DEEP then requires time to approve the plan or potentially require adjustments to be made. So there's time built in for that. And then the producers themselves need time afterwards to be able to then implement contracts, put in place the system, because they can't move on putting together that system until they've got an approval on that plan. So I think Mary's got a very good point. Ontario's a little bit different than the approach that's being taken here. This approach is similar to, again, Ontario started out with a plan-based approach and has now moved to more of a direct targets being actually established by the government. But any other state will need some time to make sure that the producers themselves have been properly identified, that they're aware of their responsibility, and they have time to actually establish. And that's one of the main problems in Ontario. There wasn't enough time. And so requirements are in place and people don't even know who the producer is. So, this is something that's difficult always within government, is politics sometimes pushes things at a quicker rate, but there are consequences with that. And I would say there have been challenges for all parties, for municipalities, for service providers, and for producers based on the system in Ontario moving too quickly.
Thanks. So just in case there are people on the webinar who aren't familiar with the Connecticut Environmental Agency, when Peter said DEEP, he wasn't being philosophical. That is the Connecticut Environmental Agency. So just to clarify. So Peter, that was a very articulate and helpful answer. The punchline is, or the bottom line, when do you hope the program will be fully implemented in Connecticut? We realize it may not be reality-based, but when do you hope it will be fully implemented?
No, there is a scheduled timeline within the legislation itself. Jen, it's October 2025. Am I right in saying that?
I think I'm off mute. Yes, I was going to say 26, but I remember there's 2 dates. There's it's a timeline. So there's a plan that has to be introduced, and then once the plan has been introduced and then approved by Connecticut DEEP, then it can
move
fully
forward.
operated.
Great.
And that is built in, Lynn, that is built in directly into the legislation itself around the timeline that all producers are required to implement. So all are required to have the plans in at exactly the same time. And that provides a level playing field for everybody. So, Worthington per se isn't necessarily getting treated differently than other producers. Everybody is required to implement at the same time.
Thanks. So I think either, actually any of the presenters can answer this question. So what does it take for a collection site, literally? Is it specialized containers? Is it oversight? Is it suppression equipment? Like, what is literally needed at a collection site?
And Jen, you can answer this probably in more detail than I can, but there's going to be some differences state to state as to what the requirements that are in place. What I can say Worthington is concerned about is they want to make sure that those cylinders are being collected safely, that they have agreements in place, that there is the proper training of staff so that they're being managed properly, and that they're meeting all of the laws. So one of the things that will happen once the plan is approved is Worthington then will enter into agreements with all of the various parties included in the slide. So state parks, municipalities, recycling facilities, to make sure that they are properly training staff, that they've got the right safety conditions in place to collect those cylinders. And so that there's some, again, there's no concerns around liability, because there are some horror stories around, certainly like the picture Jen showed. Nobody wants those things collected in a shopping cart or used for shooting practice out back. We want to make sure these things are safely collected and properly managed.
Great, thanks. So Mary,
I can just.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jen. Please go ahead.
Sorry, Lynn. Just to add to that, there are already protocols in place at our transfer stations. There are already requirements per the transfer station general permit that is issued to our transfer stations from Connecticut DEP. They are supposed to be put behind a cage, collected in a safe location. And so those will remain, but I think also hand in hand with our stewardship program, we will work with those who will be collecting them for ease as well. And like Peter said, they shouldn't be collected in a grocery cart, as you saw in that slide. In one of the slides I had, that actually was at a transfer station. That is actually how they were collecting them, because we don't accept them. They're actually not accepted at our transfer stations. You're not supposed to bring them there, but often we have transfer station operators that are overwhelmed by the residents coming in all at one time. They can't manage all of the individual residents, so they just leave things behind. And then the transfer station operators are sort of trying to hurry to find a place to put this material. And in this instance, at this particular transfer station, they put them in a grocery cart. So we hope that this program will actually create a more unified, concise protocol for collection and storage.
Great, thank you.
Maybe I can just add, Lynn, really quickly. So in Ontario, there are certainly for parks, there are caged containers that are used to collect those cylinders at parks. So generally there is safe containers that are provided to the sites that are collecting. There is some issues around collecting from potentially retail sites. There needs to be proper conditions in place, and there are different requirements, fire department requirements that are different per state. So that is one of the issues that I think Worthington is trying to grapple with, and why we've initiated a pilot to start that process around how can we make sure these things can be collected at some of those types of retail sites.
Great. So Mary, switching gears a little bit, what is driving the competition between the PROs?
Yeah, so I think what's driving competition between them is they all have different types of services to offer, right? So if you're a producer and you're looking to choose between different pros, you might be looking at service levels, at ease of reporting and interaction with them, at their actual costs. The pros themselves all have different costs for the same materials. So there's a variety of different factors that might influence a producer's decision to go with Pro A over Pro B. And it's really been a fascinating thing to be watching here in Ontario lately is what the pros are doing. For HSP, we're not seeing, it's not quite there yet because it's still fairly new. But when you look at something like our tires regulation, which came in 2018, you see competition among the pros, differing rates, different service levels and packages. You see producers switching pros mid-year, producers selecting multiple pros to meet their obligations. So as the regulations mature and as the program matures, we use the word program, but it really isn't a program. You start to see this level of competition in the marketplace, which really is intended to drive the innovation, which is one of the rationales and the policy intent behind what the ministry put out here in terms of having a competing network, so that the producers had choice.
Great, thanks.
Oh,
go ahead, Peter.
Just add really quickly, because I think in the past, Ontario's had a sort of one pro system, and certainly there was concerns from some smaller producers or more niche products that they weren't getting listened to as part of those programs. So they were dealing with a higher cost, and the programs weren't delivering what they wanted to see. With a multi-pro system now, they have options. So a company, and I'll use the example of SodaStream. SodaStream in Ontario has chosen, they've got their own collection system that happens through retailers. So they've got an ability to operate a program outside of other materials. And so that allows some ability, again, for the type of innovation you might want to see, so that you're achieving better outcomes and a more efficient system overall.
Great. So we have some specific questions about the Connecticut law, I'll say law, and Ontario. So I'll start with the Connecticut ones first. So I'll ask 2 questions so that you can address them as you wish. One question will be, so I'm going to ask both questions at once. How does Connecticut intend to handle out-of-state sales? And the Connecticut language says the program will be free to residents and consumers, but it's not apparent whether it's going to be free to municipalities or the pros that collect it. So Connecticut questions first.
Yeah, so sales, so the definition of producers ensures that any sales that are happening outside, the entity potentially importing those materials is captured. There's a hierarchy in how that definition is set. It starts with the entity that is most connected to the design and manufacture, which is the brand, and then it moves down from there, from brand then to importer, and you get further down. So anyone potentially supplying that cylinder is caught in that definition. So that captures that definition. The second
so that's how you ensure that a sale that took out of place is still being covered when the material is collected in state.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
so again, this is a similar example that's been used for a whole bunch of different types of material, including regular sort of consumer packaging.
Yep, thank you.
And then the second part of the question was dealing with, and I'm sorry, I didn't write it down quickly enough.
So that you made it clear that in Connecticut, the pending law, that for consumers and municipalities, that there would be no cost. But it wasn't apparent whether that was true for PROs. Excuse me, I scrambled that. It was clear that it was free for individuals, but it's not clear if it's free for municipalities who collect and PROs who have separate collection sites.
Sorry. There would be a contract that would be in place between the municipality and the program to collect those materials. To ensure that it's a free program for consumers, the municipality wouldn't be able to charge a fee to people that are dropping off materials, but there would be compensation and collection provided by the producer. I hope that answers.
So while it might be a cost to the municipality to collect and prepare it for recycling and transportation, they would be reimbursed for it.
I mean, collection would likely happen through the program itself. So they would arrange for collection from those municipalities. The program is going to need to know how much material is picked up, where it goes, and how it's processed.
Right.
So the producers will want to have direct knowledge of that information. And so instead of the municipality handling it on their own, they'll likely need to be some kind of an agreement. That might be slightly different with events and things like that, but that detail is going to get worked out over the next couple of months as we start to sort of put the legislation into place.
Thank you. So now,
and then I have a question that sort of relates to this a little bit.
you
So
better stick with Connecticut because next are Ontario questions.
this is actually for either Ontario or Connecticut.
Uh-oh.
Talk a little bit about we haven't really talked that much about what happens after collection. What's the end of life look like, or recycling look like for these materials? Are they 100% recycled? What happens with that?
And let me just interject that actually we did have one question that was asking, how does a PRO ensure that the cylinders are managed from cradle to grave? So I think that's an expansion of what you were just asking, Terry.
So they're generally the pro or the producer group, or whether it's the producer individually, is going to require from their collectors and processors proper documentation on how those cylinders are being managed. There's going to be requirements of them based on the servicing that they're providing. So typically, those cylinders, the gas is extracted from those cylinders. So let's say the non-refillable camping propane cylinders, they generally are connected to like you do with a 20-pound cylinder. They're collected or are connected. The gas is extracted from that. From that point, then they're punctured and they're usually compacted, and then scrap dealers will deal with them. So that's the usual process for those types of cylinders. So that would likely be the process. We are talking about some different gases, so there's some different management associated with each of those materials. But again, typically the gas is extracted, they're punched, compacted, and then shipped to a scrap facility, which would be recycling those metals. Very efficient system. The requirements in Ontario are probably low. I think they're 94% recycling efficiency. Likely very, very little of that product would actually go towards disposal. There may be some plastics, small plastic bits that might be associated, but the vast majority of that material would be 100% recycled.
Thanks. Mary, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I was going to say in terms of how we ensure that's happening is through the authority's role. So Peter's right, like there's the process that's set up and followed, and he's outlined it there. It is a 95% recycling efficiency rate that is required. And so those processors have to report into the authority in terms of what their efficiency rate of their facility is, how many cylinders they received, where they all went, including downstream in some cases. The pros themselves are reporting that information to us. We require, the regulation requires audits by a third party to be conducted on that management. And then the authority, as noted on one of those slides, has full inspection rights as well. So if we want to show up and find out what's actually happening with the cylinders, compare it to the data that we've had reported, we can send inspectors appointed under our statute into those facilities to track it. So the authority set up very well in terms of the regulatory body to ensure that what is being said is happening is actually happening.
Right. Mary, are the gases recycled, reused, or is this solely the metal?
This is solely speaking to the pressurized container, not the gas contained inside.
Okay, thanks. So let me, if I could, I'll just move ahead to some, we're running out of time, some Connecticut specific questions. Does the Ontario requirement include, I'm going to ask you several questions here, Mary, all of them. Include non-pressurized containers? Does it include non-refillable foam insulation containers? And who pays for all of this?
So under the framework, everything is covered. It's a producer responsibility framework. So the producers are the ones who are accountable for setting it up and any costs associated with meeting those outcomes that they're required to meet. So if there's costs associated with setting up the collection system, the management system, and ensuring that that's met, it's the producer. And our statutes are very explicit to the fact that it cannot be the consumer. So the idea is under an IPR framework, the producer is responsible. Your specific question, I'd have to check with the team to find out if that material was obligated.
Okay.
But it's not the gases, it's not what's inside, it's the type of the container itself that is obligated. So we can certainly get back to you as to whether or not that's covered by our regulation.
So, okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Do any of these laws include design requirements?
There are none in the HSP regulation. Like design for the container?
Yeah, making them
Design for the
safer,
environment.
or having a percentage of recycled content, or anything
No.
like that. No.
There's no requirements in the HSP regulation.
Okay.
So I would argue slightly the whole intention of these things is to build in design for the environment, because you're internalizing the cost of managing these things at the end of life, and that does in itself incent design for the environment. So I think the whole act itself does that. As you start to add in requirements around recycled content and other areas, you really do end up with the potential to create lots of unintended consequences. So Ontario has included some recycled content requirements. I don't think Mary can say this, but I would say to you, they are almost impossible to provide proper oversight and enforcement over. And the way that they're set up in Ontario is they provide an incentive. So they reduce your management requirements, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing. You want producers to be collecting more of these things, not giving them incentives to collect less because they've got recycled content in them.
But to clarify, that's only for electronics and batteries in Ontario that have a recycled content incentive. Pressurized containers in HSP doesn't include one.
Doesn't. Okay. So,
Lynn, can I add to that?
I guess so.
So it does, some of the language in House Bill 5142 does establish that the program shall have refilling, recycling cylinders, and capturing residual gases for reuse, establish performance goals. And I think through the various requirements that the plan should include, I think within that it does hold for the hierarchy of the environment consideration. And then I also want to just point out the question that was asked regarding what do you do with cylinders that are coming into the state? I mean, because there's two parts to that we as boots on the ground at transfer stations or municipalities, I mean, this is an issue with all material, particularly when you have EPR programs. What do you do when someone from out of state is bringing you material that was purchased from outside of the state? I think we're always going to see a little bit of that leakage, no matter where we are in whatever state, because we have border towns. At the same time, most of our municipalities require a permit from the resident. You must be a resident to utilize the drop-off program. So if it's a municipality drop-off, you're not likely going to get someone from out of town or out of state. That being said, we also have folks who live out of state and come into our state for weekenders or summer home. we consider them residents. They pay taxes. They will likely be able to utilize these programs. We also, the reality is, residents or consumers who are looking for disposal, they want easy and convenient. They're not going to drive out of their way just to save $3. I don't believe they're going to drive 20 miles into Connecticut to save a few dollars. It's really going to be, it's a local program. So I'm not quite concerned about the issues of crossing border disposal.
Great, thanks. Mary, are there other provinces besides Ontario that have EPR laws for these sorts of containers?
Yes, and I think you saw at the beginning there, Peter had a great slide that outlined in Canada which jurisdictions in Canada have them and which jurisdictions are considering them. When you combine the ones that have them and are considering them, we're fairly covered in Canada for them being included.
Good. So I wanted to call that out before I got to the actual question, which was, is there either now or anticipated coordination among those laws and PROs that are fulfilling these requirements?
Yeah, so our PRA as the regulator has no mandate given to us by the government to ensure there's harmonization at the federal level. But in terms of our operations, we do certainly reach out and communicate very regularly with all of our counterparts about what they're doing, how are they confirming different management requirements, if they have audit requirements being put on a service provider, what do they look like? Can we just adopt the same ones? Because often they are operating across multiple jurisdictions. So we do attempt to do that, even though we don't have a direct mandate to do that, because in Canada, it is provincially regulated. It isn't a federal process. There are other, groups, the Canadian Council for Ministers of Environment, who operate at a federal level that do try to seek some harmonization. Some of these pros operate across Canada. Some pros in some of the material categories operate in the States as well. So there are certainly goals for harmonization, and we attempt to do that where possible and where our regulation would allow some of that collaboration.
Great, thank you. Now, Jen, at the very beginning, you showed us some horrible videos. And there was a question of somebody wants to see them again or share them. So could you refresh our memory, please? Where could one find those in a public source?
Well, they were sent to me directly from the material recovery facilities. So it's not like something I captured from the internet, or it was available through YouTube. I'm happy to share the files. If someone asks for them, I can do a shared Dropbox link.
Okay, great.
They're not like proprietary.
Well, they are in your slides, which will be on our websites, right?
Yeah, so you can get them through the slides.
And the recording also. Yes. But somebody was asking the direct question. So we literally only have a couple of more minutes. So why are fire extinguishers, and I thought it was a funny pun, hot spots, hot points? Peter, you said, those aren't there, and why?
Well, originally in 2020, we actually had fire extinguishers in the language, and then when it was reintroduced in 2021, through conversations of what will stick and who will oppose it, it was removed because lots of fears around people need to buy them, and if there's an eco fee or something that prevents residents from buying them, then legislators won't pass the law. And so it was like to remove that as an obstacle for now. I mean, I think at some point we need to deal with them. They are not most standard household fire extinguishers are not hazardous. They actually have a fertilizer in them, an agent that can be reused. It can be removed and reused or repurposed. They are, at the end of the day, though, difficult to manage. Residents often don't know what to do with them. We do get them at HHW events. So it's to be continued, Lynn.
Thank you. Mary, what about Ontario? Are they covered in Ontario?
And no, they're listed as excluded as HSP. Whether or not the Ministry of Environment here wants to include a particular regulation for them at a later date, they'll have to explore that.
Great. So do any of these programs that we're discussing either have or plan to have public educational resources about, well, that was nice. You're not going to take it. What should I do? So whether it's fire extinguishers or any of these other, what looks to the public like similar products. Mary, in your resources, do those exist, or are there any intentions for such resources in Connecticut?
So you mean, you're not going to take my fire extinguisher?
Yeah,
What?
now what?
No.
Yeah.
No, the IFR legislations, at least under this framework, are very specific to those obligated materials. And so they're not, producers aren't required to do any sort of education on anything except for the material that's identified by that regulation. There are P&E requirements for their material, not for materials not covered.
Okay. And Peter or Jen, do you have anything to say that's different?
Maybe I'll start quickly. So Worthington is not a producer of fire extinguishers, but yeah, we did, as we put the plan together, we certainly heard from municipalities that this was something they were collecting in numbers. But there was a big concern. We wanted to see this legislation move forward, and we were concerned about adding materials that might create a barrier. The plan will fully include information on where people can take the cylinders that are designated, but not necessarily fire extinguishers. Just given that's the producers that are caught are probably not those producers.
I see, that's interesting.
So I'll make it real quick. In our 14 municipalities, unfortunately, in this, I can only speak for my 14 towns. So I am always looking for a solution, and I have partnered with a company called Fire Control Services. Sorry about that. Fire Control Services out of New Milford, Connecticut. And I've partnered with them. They will take the fire extinguishers. They do dismantle them. They scrap the metal. They find a buyer for the fertilizer or the agent that's inside. They do charge us $5 per unit, but I'm able to collect them at our transfer stations. Our transfer stations then get them to this service provider for recycling. Not all towns want to participate because it is $5 per unit, but we're working on that.
That's great. That's tremendous. Thank you, Jen. Well, these have been just wonderful presentations and information, and congratulations to Connecticut on your leadership on this. One can hope that at least in the New England regions, once the governor signs the bill, that everybody else will say, well, why didn't we do this? You did reference Vermont, but maybe you'll get passed. So thank you so much, everybody, and to our audience. Terry, did you want to be the one to highlight our upcoming webinars, or would you like me to do that? No, thank you. Okay. So, NERC and NMOA have a couple of webinars coming up on June 1st, also at 1 Eastern, Purchasing Standards for Low Carbon Concrete. And we have a webinar on June 14th, which is Avoiding Contamination in Food Waste Feedstock for Composting. And a NERC webinar on June 6th, so in between those two, Successful Glass Recycling in Rural Communities. I know that you can find the registration links for those on the NERC homepage. I would, Terry, I have to say, I'm not sure where on the NMOA website you would find the registration links, but we do a lot of publicity, so you'll find them, or Terry will now answer that question. Publicity, okay. With that, again, tomorrow you'll find on the NERC homepage the PowerPoint presentations and the recording. NMOA will do likewise. We both post them on the recordings on YouTube as well. And with that, I'll say again, thank you so much to everybody for participating, fascinating, and leadership. So all good. So thank you so much. And with that, Terry, do you want to say goodbye?
No, thanks everyone. And this was a great set of presentations, really, really well coordinated among you. And congratulations to Connecticut. It's really exciting to see this moving forward after all these years of hard work that you all have been involved with, and all the other stakeholders. So
thank you, and have a great afternoon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.